when Dave Grohl stood up to speak at Kurt Cobain's memorial service on April 10, 1994. He had prepared words about friendship, about music, about loss. But as the Beatles' In My Life began playing through the speakers of the Unity Church of Truth in Seattle, the Nirvana drummer broke down completely, unable to finish what he was saying. The 25-year-old musician who had been trying to be strong for everyone else suddenly collapsed into his chair, sobbing uncontrollably. What happened next, and why that specific song was chosen for Kurt's farewell, reveals a heartbreaking truth about the Nirvana frontman's final days that even his closest friends didn't fully understand until that moment. The choice of this particular Beatles song wasn't random or coincidental. It was deliberate, calculated, and carried a message that Kurt had been trying to communicate for months before his death. But to understand why In My Life became the song that would forever define Kurt Cobain's funeral, you need to know about a conversation that happened 3 weeks before his death. A conversation that only now, 30 years later, makes complete and devastating sense. It was March 15, 1994, at Sound City Studios in Van Nuys, California. The same studio where Nirvana had recorded Nevermind 3 years earlier, where they had changed the world with Smells Like Teen Spirit. But on this day there was no triumphant energy, no sense of creating history. The band had gathered for what would be their final recording session together, though nobody knew it at the time. They were supposed to be working on new material for the follow-up to In Utero, but Kurt seemed distracted, distant, like his body was in the room but his mind was somewhere else entirely. During a break in the session, around 3 p.m., Kurt did something completely out of character. He pulled Dave Grohl aside and asked him to come to the control room, alone. "Just for a minute," Kurt said, his voice quiet, almost fragile. "I need to share something with you." It was weird, Grohl would later tell close friends, though he's never spoken about this publicly until being asked about it directly years later. Kurt rarely shared music like that, especially not Beatles stuff. He loved them, we all knew that. But he was almost protective of that love, like it was too personal, too pure to share with the world. Kurt had a portable CD player with him. This was 1994, before iPods, before streaming. He pulled out a well-worn copy of the Beatles' Rubber Soul album. The CD was scratched, clearly played hundreds of times. He skipped to track 11, In My Life. They sat in the control room, just the two of them, while Chris Novoselic and producer Adam Casper waited in the live room. As John Lennon's voice filled the space, Dave watched Kurt's face transform. The exhaustion, the pain that had become Kurt's default expression in recent months, seemed to momentarily lift. "There are places I remember all my life, though some have changed," Lennon sang, and Kurt closed his eyes, mouthing along to every word. When the song ended, Kurt opened his eyes and looked directly at Dave. What he said next wouldn't make sense to Dave until weeks later. "This is how I want to be remembered. Not for the noise, not for the anger, not for the controversy, for this feeling, this tenderness. Do you understand?" Dave nodded, though he admits he didn't really understand. Not then. How could he have known that Kurt was essentially planning his own funeral, choosing his own eulogy? "Promise me something," Kurt continued, still holding the CD player. "If something happens to me, make sure this song gets played. Make sure people know this is who I really was." Dave felt uncomfortable. "Nothing's going to happen to you, man. You're just tired. The tour was rough, but just promise me," Kurt interrupted, and there was something in his eyes, not desperation exactly, but a kind of resigned certainty that made Dave's stomach turn. "I promise," Dave said, not knowing he would have to keep that promise just 3 weeks later. The memorial service took place on April 10, 1994, at Unity Church of Truth in Seattle's Capitol Hill neighborhood. It was a private gathering, just family, close friends, the surviving members of Nirvana. The church was small, intimate, with stained glass windows that cast colored shadows across the wooden pews. Outside, Seattle was experiencing one of those rare sunny April days, which somehow made everything feel more surreal. Courtney Love was there, dressed in a black dress that had belonged to Kurt, holding 20-month-old Frances Bean, who kept asking for data in a voice that broke everyone's heart. Kurt's mother, Wendy O'Connor, sat in the front row, her face a mask of shock and grief. She had told reporters just days earlier that Kurt had joined that stupid club, referring to the 27 club of musicians who died at that age. Chris Novoselic, Nirvana's 6'7" bassist, looked lost, folded into a pew that seemed too small for his frame. Pat Smear, who had joined as a touring guitarist, sat with members of Kurt's extended family. Dylan Carlson, Kurt's best friend, wasn't there, too devastated and guilt-ridden to attend, blaming himself for purchasing the shotgun Kurt had used. The service had been planned hastily. Kurt's body had been discovered on April 8 by an electrician who had come to install a security system at Kurt's Lake Washington home. The news had exploded across the world within hours. NTV had interrupted regular programming. Vigils were being held from Seattle to Prague. But here, in this small church, it was just the people who really knew Kurt, trying to say goodbye. The service began with a Buddhist monk chanting. Courtney had insisted on this, knowing Kurt's interest in Buddhism. Then various people spoke. Chris told a story about the early days of Nirvana, playing to 5 people in dive bars, how Kurt would give everything to those 5 people, as if they were 5,000. An aunt talked about Kurt as a hyperactive child, always drawing, always singing. Then it was Dave's turn to speak. He had prepared remarks about Kurt's genius, about his kindness that people didn't often see, about his dedication to his art. But as he stood at the small podium looking at Frances Bean in Courtney's arms, at Wendy O'Connor's devastated face, the words felt hollow, insufficient. That's when the opening notes of In My Life began playing through the church's sound system. When that song started playing, Chris Novoselic later recalled in a private conversation, it was like Kurt was in the room with us. Not his ghost or spirit or whatever, but his essence, his real self. Everyone just broke down, Dave especially. He knew something we didn't. What Dave knew was not just the significance of that song to Kurt as a Beatles fan, but as someone who had been contemplating his own mortality for months. In My Life is fundamentally a song about reflection, about looking back on places and people you've loved and lost, about how memory shapes us even as it fades. For Kurt, who had spent his final months feeling increasingly isolated and misunderstood, the song represented something he desperately wanted people to understand about him. The lyrics took on new meaning in that church. There are places I remember, all my life, though some have changed, some forever, not for better. Some have gone and some remain. For Kurt, who had watched his beloved Seattle music scene transform from an authentic underground movement into a commercial phenomenon, these words held special meaning. He had seen his favorite clubs close or become tourist attractions, his friends change under the pressure of success, his city become something unrecognizable. But it was the song's bridge that really captured what Kurt had been feeling in his final days, the idea that despite all the people and places in your life, one love can eclipse them all. For Kurt, that love was complex. It was his love for Frances Bean, his daughter who was not even 2 years old. It was his love for music before it became his burden. It was his love for a simpler time before fame consumed everything. Danny Goldberg, Nirvana's former manager, was sitting 3 rows back in the church. When In My Life played, I saw Courtney holding Frances, and I realized this song was Kurt's. He saying goodbye to his daughter. It was his way of telling her that, even though he wouldn't be there, his love for her would never fade. The line about loving people more, that was for Frances. The song continued playing, and with each verse, the small church seemed to fill with memories. Everyone had their own Kurt to remember. For some, he was the explosive performer who could channel rage into art. For others, he was the quiet, funny friend who would spend hours discussing music theory or drawing strange cartoons. For Courtney, he was the complicated husband who could be tender one moment and distant the next. For Frances, he was simply Dada, a voice and a presence she would only know through recordings and photographs. Kurt's relationship with the Beatles went back to his childhood in Aberdeen, Washington. It was 1974. Kurt was 7 years old, and his parents had just divorced, a trauma that would shape the rest of his life. His Aunt Mary, trying to comfort the devastated boy, had given him a copy of Meet the Beatles. It was one of the few possessions he carried with him as he bounced between relatives' homes during his turbulent youth, sleeping on couches in friends' basements, sometimes under bridges. He wore that record out, his mother Wendy recalled in the days after his death. Even when he got into punk rock as a teenager, even when he was playing the heaviest, most aggressive music with Nirvana, he would still listen to the Beatles alone in his room. They were his comfort music, his escape. Michael Azerrad, who wrote the authorized Nirvana biography Come As You Are, had spent hours interviewing Kurt in 1992 and 1993. In public interviews, Kurt rarely discussed his Beatles fandom in depth. He was more likely to name-check underground bands like the Raincoats or the Vaselines to maintain his indie credibility. But when we were alone, off the record, he would talk about the Beatles for hours. Azerrad remembered one particular conversation. I asked him what music he listened to when he was alone, when nobody was around to judge. He got quiet for a long time. Then he said, "The Beatles. Always the Beatles. They understood melody in a way that nobody else did. They understood that you could be experimental and still write a perfect pop song. That's all I've ever tried to do. Write Beatles songs through a fuzz pedal." In Kurt's journals, discovered after his death and later published, there are numerous references to Beatles songs, sketches, inspired by their album covers, and lyrics that reference their work. One entry from December 1993 reads, "John Lennon wrote in my life when he was 20. I'm 26 and I feel like I've lived 10 lifetimes. When will my life actually begin?" The choice of In My Life for the memorial service becomes even more poignant when you understand that Kurt had been listening to it obsessively in his final weeks. Friends reported that he would play it on repeat in his car, driving aimlessly around Seattle at night. Sometimes he would just sit in his garage with the engine off, the song playing through the speakers, tears streaming down his face. Pat Smear, who had joined Nirvana as a touring guitarist in 1993, remembered walking in on Kurt listening to the song just days before the Rome incident on March 4th. He had his headphones on, sitting in a hotel room in Paris. His eyes were closed, and he was crying. I started to back out, but he saw me. He took off the headphones and said, "This song understands." I asked what he meant. He said, "It understands that love and death are the same thing. They're both about letting go." The Rome incident, Kurt's overdose on champagne and Rohypnol, initially reported as accidental but later understood to be a suicide attempt, happened just 11 days after that session at Sound City, where Kurt had played In My Life for Dave. The timeline suggests that Kurt had been planning his exit for some time, and that the song was part of that plan. Back in the church, as the song played, Dave Grohl was experiencing a complete breakdown. He later described it as feeling like emotional vertigo, suddenly understanding all the signs he had missed, all the conversations that now took on different meanings. The way Kurt had hugged him extra long after that Sound City session. The way he had said "take care of yourself" instead of his usual "see you later." The way he had given away several of his guitars to friends in those final weeks, claiming he had too many. He was saying goodbye, Dave reflected years later in a rare moment of candor. In his own way, he was trying to tell us. But we were all too caught up in the day-to-day chaos of being in Nirvana, of dealing with the business, the tours, the pressure, to see it. That song was his suicide note, as much as the actual letter he left. The actual suicide note, which Courtney Love would read portions of at the public vigil later that day, quoted Neil Young's, My, hey, hey, it's better to burn out than to fade away." But those who were at the private service understood that In My Life was Kurt's real message, his real goodbye. It was gentler, more loving, more like the Kurt they knew when the cameras were off and the crowds were gone. As the song reached its instrumental bridge, that Baroque piano solo that George Martin played, and then sped up to sound like a harpsichord, something extraordinary happened in the church. Frances Bean, who had been fussy and crying, suddenly went quiet. She looked up at the ceiling, following something with her eyes that nobody else could see, and smiled. For just a moment, the grief in the room lifted, replaced by something else. Not quite peace, but a kind of acceptance. It was like Kurt was there, Courtney would later tell friends. Through the song, through Francis's reaction, he was telling us it was okay, that he was okay, that we would be okay, eventually. When the song ended, there was complete silence in the church. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. It was as if everyone was holding their breath, trying to hold on to the moment, trying to keep Kurt present just a little longer. Then Francis Bean broke the silence with a single word, "Da-da," and everyone broke down again. The public vigil that followed at Seattle Center was important for the fans, for the global mourning that needed to happen. 7,000 people gathered, holding candles, playing Nirvana songs on acoustic guitars, sharing their grief. Courtney read from Kurt's suicide note, played a recording of it, distributed some of Kurt's clothes to fans. It was cathartic and chaotic and necessary. But for those who were at that private service, "In My Life" became the definitive farewell. It was Kurt's voice speaking through John Lennon's across 3 decades, across death itself. It was an admission that despite all his rage, all his punk posturing, all his rejection of peace and love hippie values, Kurt was at heart a romantic who believed in the transcendent power of a perfect pop song. Years later, Dave Grohl would reveal more about that final Sound City session on BBC Radio, though he was careful not to share the most personal details. Kurt knew exactly what he was doing when he came that song. He knew it would destroy us, but he also knew it would help us remember him the way he wanted to be remembered. Not as the voice of a generation, not as a grunge icon, but as someone who loved deeply and was loved in return. Today, "In My Life" is still occasionally played at Nirvana tributes and on anniversaries of Kurt's death, and every time Dave Grohl has to leave the room. Not because the grief is too much, he's learned to live with that, but because he can still hear Kurt's voice from that day at Sound City, asking him if he understands, and the tragedy is that now, 30 years later, he finally does. He understands that Kurt was asking him to remember not the myth, but the man. Not the noise, but the melody. Not the ending, but the love that preceded it. The song that played at Kurt Cobain's funeral wasn't just the Beatles' "In My Life." It was Kurt's final gift to those who loved him. A reminder that beneath all the pain and chaos, there was always music, always love, always beauty. Even if, in the end, it wasn't enough to save him.